It gives me great joy to look through this public chat and see who all is with us and where you're coming from New Jersey all the way, of course, over to South Africa and Zambia, etc. So welcome all. Thank you for taking the time. I know that your time is precious, and we're actually going to talk about that to a degree today. I had to make some choices as, of course, what to speak to you about. We just have this time set aside. But I hope that you'll find it very edifying for you as we go through it. First thing I want to share with you, this is my family. Most recent picture of us. They are the center of my world, my joy. My wife, Holly, there is in the tan. My oldest daughter, Ella, on the far right, just went to university in Seattle. So she's 1,972 miles away from us. And yes, I do check that often. I'm that parent who goes on his Find My app and sees where his daughter is at college. She's studying for ministry there, doing a wonderful job with her life, getting started out in Seattle, far away. But there's my second daughter, Zoe, is on the far left, at least on my screen. She's the writer, creative writer, and journalist. She's the editor at her high school newspaper. My son Dawson there right on my back is catching up to me quickly in height. I think he's even a little taller than this picture was a couple months ago. He's just growing quickly, had his basketball tryouts for his team last night. They're the center of my world. I don't think you can know me without knowing them. And I always like to start personally that way, if you don't mind. And there's a very significant reason for that homiletically. When I titled this book that I wrote, Practicing the Preaching Life, it was very purposeful. I don't think that we perfect the preaching life. I think we practice it. I think it's something that we're always trying to work at, but it's a life. It's not just a skill. And when it's talked about as a skill divorced from life, if you don't mind me rewinding, often the people who pay the price are those that are in your picture when you put them on the screen. Whatever we devise as the way of life that surrounds and is affected by and affects our preaching, it has to weave together in such a way that the things that are most important to us don't lose life, but somehow gain life. So that's the image of the book there. I won't have time to cover all the principles within it, but if you find that picture, you found the right book. It's available in e-versions and in hard copy. I do preaching coaching, and I am a professor and I am a pastor. And people come to me for various different reasons to get help in establishing their preaching life. The number one reason that people share with me when they want to work on their preaching life, especially in a coaching relationship, is they feel like they have a creativity block. What do I mean by creativity block? They can't get the sermons to come, especially on time. Fred Craddock famously said in the last century that Sundays are like telephone poles on the highway. Telephone poles on the highway, meaning that one telephone pole has barely passed and the next one is on its way. I don't know if those of you who are preaching feel that way. I often feel that way. One Sunday has passed and another one's coming. I just preached. I'm just getting ready to preach again. I'm presenting at this conference. I present at another conference next week, preach at another church the following week, and then I'm back here preaching at my church, and I just preached Wednesday night. So there is a lot of creativity that has to come out of a minister's heart and life. And sometimes we end up with a creativity block. So that's why, by the way, the highest pay-per-click ad for preachers is sermon illustrations, how to find sermon illustrations, because they know that you and I, when we're desperate on a Saturday night and we just feel like our sermon doesn't have that zing, or we don't know where the story is going to come from, or boy, I wish I had something humorous, or this is so boring, we'll do that search. And when we find something that might help us with the sermon, and it says you have to pay for it, we'll click through, we'll pay $10 a month, $15 a month, whatever you need. Just give us the help, because tomorrow morning I've got to have a sermon. So sometimes people come with creativity block. Actually, that's the number one reason. The second most common reason is content burnout, that regular passing of the telephone poles experience. Sunday's coming, Sunday's coming, Sunday's coming. One writer put it this way, that if you're preaching weekly, you're putting out the equivalent of a term paper every week. the amount of content that you're producing by just preaching once weekly, even if you do it in an extemporaneous way, you have to craft that extemporaneous content. It comes from somewhere. It's the equivalent of a term paper every week. Now, it doesn't have the same necessarily scholarly rigor. If we're honest about it, many of our sermons do not have that same scholarly rigor. But if they do, then even this point is even more so true. The content quantity, though, is what I'm speaking to. So the possibility of you reaching a certain level of content fatigue is real. And if you reach content fatigue, that means you're worn out, you're tired, it's exhausting you, you get stressed, you're testy with the picture of your family that would be on the screen, you're irritable with those close to you. But when you reach content burnout, you no longer care. You just want to get something for Sunday. You don't care how you get it. And then you might pay for that whole sermon to come down in a PDF and you just read it as if it was your own. I had to confront a preacher a few years back who had plagiarized 19 sermons, read word for word from the pulpit, the best his executive assistant could count. She didn't know who to turn to, so she turned to the denominational officials that I was connected with at the time, the Wesleyan Church. They asked me to go deal with that preacher, to do it graciously. I did chores in his backyard and then broke the news. It was a very difficult conversation, but the diagnosis was he was in burnout and he just no longer cared. He just had to fill the time. Now we had a church of 3,000 people in weekly attendance. So it's not just people who are struggling along and have no staff help. Sometimes people with large teams are facing this dynamic. The third most common reason people ask me for help is the time crunch. And if I was to ask you to write a sermon but for next year, October 1 of 2023, so a year and a day from now, I don't think you would feel too anxious about it, at least not in the moment. But when you have to get a sermon together for Sunday or next Sunday, there's a different level of anxiety. And then put together with that all of the many different competing requirements of ministry. Last night, I was at a fundraising dinner for a church plant that we are launching about an hour away. We were getting recruiting and getting volunteers to go to that church plant. We needed to also raise the funds to support it. The night before, I was preaching at our midweek service. The night before, I had family time, and it was very focused family time. But the night before that, I was down at a different church plant an hour away from that. The day before that, I was preaching on Sunday. That regular demand of time is significant. Tuesday was all-day meetings, but I had the evening off. I know that many of you have that same sort of experience where you are trying to manage your time, figure out where you get your Sabbath, your time off, manage your energy. The time crunch is part of where the crux of it all comes into bear. The ones who put this closest to me was a group of Haitian pastors who met with me for a seminar down in Laganav, Haiti, all bivocational, all were taking time off of work without pay to sleep on a concrete floor while I taught them every day in the unair-conditioned tabernacle where we were meeting, and then we worshiped all night until about 11 before we went to bed and got up and did it again. And their time crunch was significant and real. These weren't full-time ministers. They couldn't shuffle the daytime hours. They had to figure out in evenings and weekends how to get it all together. When I realized time was their key issue, I started working differently, and that made me work backwards. And over the next 5-6 years in surveys and studies, I realized that this is actually the order in which the problem occurs, not just for bivocational ministers in Haiti, for all preachers. That year-out sermon is no problem. You have plenty of time to get it together. It won't cause you content burnout, and you probably won't have creativity block. The issue is your time crunch because of the complexity of your preaching life. Now, I don't have time today to talk about the purpose of preaching, the aim of preaching, all the different things preaching accomplishes, the virtues of the preacher, how you establish your life in God so that it flows out of a deep well, not just a direct pipeline. I don't have time to talk about all of that, but I do want to focus in on what is this time crunch? What do you need to get done? And how can you start to handle that time crunch in such a way that you don't reach content burnout And then because you don't have content, creativity block. That's what I want to focus on if you'll give me that privilege. If not, I suppose I can't see you. You could just hit mute and go watch your favorite streaming show. Watch that next Ring of Powers episode on Amazon Prime, whatever you choose to do. But I hope you'll hang in here for the next 30 minutes or so. Okay, so in brief, there are two modes of preaching that consume our time in the preaching preparation process. I give them a metaphor for each one that's memorable for me. It's helped students and pastors and professors across the years as I've shared this and they've worked on it. The first is archaeology. The second is artistry. Archaeology, of course, is a metaphor for what we do in our biblical study, hermeneutics, theological context, historical context, etc. So those of you who are students and are fresh in that training, those words are bearing new meaning for you. Those of you who are in ministry, if you didn't receive formal academic training, some of those words may seem overwhelming. Don't let them be. If you have received theological training, don't let them overwhelm you with a feeling of, oh, I don't remember all that means. I like to give it this overarching metaphor because it helps most preachers. You're digging. You're digging to uncover a world that is ancient. You're going through the dust of time, in a sense, when you're preparing to preach from a biblical passage. It's an ancient text that's come to us through a history of interpretation that we have to figure out how it speaks now to our context. This archaeological stage, in brief, is characterized by disciplined digging. If you ever go on an archaeological dig, you start early in the morning, sometimes 4:30 in the morning, before the heat of the day kicks in. In the desert sun in the Middle East, that heat is very taxing. It is a very dry heat. It will dehydrate you and wear you out. So the cool of the morning is key. And I use that as a metaphor to say, starting early in preaching, not necessarily early in the morning, but early in the flow of your preaching life is one of the most important keys for you to deal with the time crunch of preaching. The later you start, the more of a crunch you will feel. The sooner you begin, the less of a crunch you will experience. And we'll talk about that as we move forward. The core commitment of the archaeological stage or mode, it doesn't ever completely end in your preaching preparation process. They overlap. But this mode, the core commitment is that preaching is content-driven, not creativity-driven. The problem for most preachers' creativity block is that they don't have enough content. They're trying to find an illustration when they don't yet have something to illustrate. I've found that again and again and again and again. I've coached many, many preachers. I'm in 6 coaching relationships currently at this particular moment. That's the lowest coaching load I've had in quite some time because I've re-entered full-time pastoral ministry with joy. I've been asking the Lord to give me that privilege again, and I found a way to do that and still do academic work. And the regularity of finding this in preachers is stunning to me. When they're struggling to find the illustration, and I ask them for clarity on their content, the clarity on their content isn't there. They're hoping the illustration will back them into some sort of clarity on their content. It just doesn't work that way. Preaching is content driven. The whole world is a sermon illustration. Once you have a clear sermon in your pocket. Haven't you noticed that experience when you're done preaching and then you're walking through life the next day or two and you realize, oh, look at that. Oh, look at that story. Listen to that. I wish I'd had that Sunday. I wish I'd seen that before. Oh, that would have made a great illustration. The reason is you finally found your sermon while you were preaching. And after you were done preaching, the illustrations came. So preaching is content driven. Don't get the creativity cart in front of the content horse. If that illustration makes sense to you. The end result of archaeology is a range of meaning. Scripture is not singular in its meaning or implications. When we have a whole passage, there are multiple sentences. Each sentence has its own meaning. And with that also, there is a range of potential interpretation that is orthodox. So there is a play that is there, but it's anchored to that original audience and the original authorial intent. Now, I recognize that that is a particular kind of hermeneutic. It's one that I am committed to. I hope that you are as well. It doesn't lock you in, though, to interpretations that no longer apply today. That range of meaning then arcs out from meaning to implications to applications, and that range gets wider and wider, and you make your pastoral judgment within it. But if you sever authorial intent and original meaning, then you might as well just say whatever you want to say, because that's what you're ending up doing. And we might as well not pretend that the text is something special to us. It's just an ancient text that we find beautiful and it inspires us, but we say what we want. So that's the archaeological stage, a quick flyover. Now, let me drill down just a little bit. The goal of this is to uncover a world. I'm going to come back to this image in a moment, but this archaeologist is trying not just to quickly find as much stuff as he can. He's carefully uncovering the life that is buried in the dust. I love what William Brower once said about Scripture. He said, Scripture is blood turned into ink. Our job is to turn that ink back into blood. So Scripture is life frozen in text. Our job is to take the text and bring it back out of that cryogenic freeze and turn it into life. So we're not just trying to uncover what this particular paragraph means. We're trying to see through that paragraph to the world that's behind it, that it is referencing, and then to get into that world so that we can understand that world in its context, and then the Scriptures will resonate, and that world will resonate with our world. There's several different modes that we can use in this archaeological mode. I'm going to shorten today's presentation to just a few. The first is single passage discovery. When we're doing a single passage discovery, hopefully we've marked out in advance what passage we're trying to study, so that by the time we get there to study for the coming sermon, we already have a pre-plotted place of ground, so to speak, that we're going to work on. Notice the strings that are already there. Archaeologists map out their whole digging project, and in that digging project, they have pre-plotted spaces where each person's going to dig. So the single passage discovery is characterized by a level of analysis that is word by word. So if you're only working on a paragraph, let's say, you can study that in detailed observations, word by word. Now, we have a document I'd like to share with you called a detailed observation template. And in that detailed observation document, what I suggest preachers do to just jumpstart their preaching preparation as soon as possible is to open that up, rename it with your sermon, keep that blank template in a different space, rename it with the sermon you're doing, and set a timer for 15 minutes and just make observations of the text. Observe the most basic thing possible. Ask a question, several questions, a question of definition, a question of reason, a question of implication about the passage, that word or that phrase, and then give your interpretive hunches, your best guesses in the third column, and move on. You'll come back then and answer the questions you raise and confirm the hunches that you have as you go through your archaeological process using tools like word studies, theological dictionaries, the summary material, historical background material, and a commentary, etc. But opening the can, so to speak, of the passage, one turn at a time, is a powerful way to get you started. 15 minutes is all it takes. So 2 weeks before I'm going to preach, I can take 15 minutes, open the passage, set a timer, and just start working on a word-by-word analysis. Now, you can elevate that at multiple levels. So if it's not a just single passage, let's say it's a whole chapter, you're going to need to study more in terms of sentence by sentence or even paragraph by paragraph. If you're studying a whole book, then you may need to elevate that to section by section, segment by segment, or even chapter by chapter levels of analysis. So I don't have time to go over each of those, but I think you get the principle. Please don't try to do word by word analysis when you're preaching on a section that's 3 chapters long. That will exhaust you, wear you out, and you won't have enough time. talk about time crunch. I had a preacher who actually did that once, spent 40 hours on a sermon and didn't have it yet together. So the next level of analysis or way of going at a study of a passage is passages built on passages. So sometimes we're working expositorily through either small or large sections. Other times we find a passage that perhaps we even thought we were going to work through expositorily. And we find that passage is referenced in other places of Scripture multiple times. I won't go through the whole illustration of this, but for example, a clear example would be Stephen's speech in the book of Acts. When he gives his speech in front of the religious leaders of the day, he gives a summary view of their treatment of the prophets across Israel's history. Each sentence is a reference in a way to another layer of time, as you see on that picture, another epoch of time. And each of those epochs or time periods is another section to at least get a basic understanding. So our level of analysis then can't be word by word, and I just look at Stephen's speech, or I won't understand what he's referencing. I have to do at least a basic reading in context of each of those leveled passages. If I flip it on its head and I study Genesis chapter 12 with Abram and his journey in the story of Terah, I might misunderstand that passage and its interpretation in Scripture if I don't recognize that it's referenced by Stephen's speech. And he clarifies one of the ambiguities in the Hebrew's verbiage by telling us that Abram received the word of the Lord while he was still in his original land of Ur. It wasn't as though Terah received the word alone and then didn't get the job done. The word had always come to Terah and Abram. And Abram seemed to actually be the center from the beginning. I might misinterpret that passage if I don't recognize that it has layers. So when I study a passage and realize that it has layers, sometimes what I need to do in the sermon and in the preparation process as well is go epic by epic. So in a sense, I've just jumped from the smallest level of analysis, word by word, up to the largest level of analysis, epoch by epoch, to help you realize that if you've been given a singular way of preparing to preach, and you feel like you have to use all of those tools every time at the same level of analysis, it will exhaust you as a preacher. You don't have enough time. It's sometimes not possible. So the next way of studying Scripture might be what I would call a fine-grained character study. And I revisit this picture of an archaeologist on purpose. I want you to notice that that right here, if you follow my cursor there, this is a paintbrush. So he is using a paintbrush to dust away the fine grain level of details on this character. So when you're studying a character, say you want to do a sermon on the Apostle Paul, or you want to do a sermon on Titus, or on Joseph, or Moses, or Jonah, I suggest that instead of studying word by word, paragraph by paragraph, chapter by chapter, or epoch by epoch, you study motive by motive. That's how plots move when they focus on character development. They reveal details, fine-grained details, that subtly show you the motive of the character, which, by the way, is why David is still celebrated, even though he does horribly evil things. His primary motivation across the major tenor of his life was to be a heart chasing after God. He still had to face consequences. He still caused great harm, and you can't sweep that away. But the motive by motive, primarily, except for a sliver of his life, was trying to chase after God. Now, why might that be important? One illustration I often use is the story of Joseph, who is often preached about as a dreamer, who was really just a model for all of us to follow in how we treat the dreams of God. But the details of the story tell us something else. At the bookends of Joseph's life, there's actually problems with the way he treats dreams. He brags in front of his brothers. That's why they throw him in a cistern. He brags and takes all of his privileges, and they throw him in a cistern. He gets sold into slavery. But then when he's in poverty and pain in the prison, he remembers the Lord, and the Lord is with him. The Lord is with him. It keeps telling us that. He glorifies the Lord when he gets an interpretation of a dream, all the way up until when he's back in power and prosperity again. And now he is second in command only to Pharaoh. The Lord drops out of the story. He does nothing unto the Lord anymore, and everything is done to Pharaoh. And instead of using the dream Pharaoh was given to create the greatest benevolence program in the history of the world to save the nations all around him, he takes all of their gold, all of their silver, all of their cattle and herds, and then enslaves all of the nations around him. It's Joseph the enslaver by the end. He doesn't just save Israel. He does do God's greater salvific purpose. That's accomplished because God will not allow his plans to be thwarted. But in terms of his humanness, his sin comes out when he's in power and prosperity, and he accumulates great wealth and slaves for Pharaoh, setting up what Hegel calls the dialectic of slavery, so that then in the book of Exodus, the Hebrews become enslaved by the people they were enslaving. And it takes all of Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges for God to try to rectify that situation that Joseph created with his dream. So when you do a motive by motive fine-grained analysis and you realize that the Lord drops out of the story as the motive, you realize that we get both sides of Joseph. That apparently Romans 3:23 applies to Joseph as well as anyone else. So when you're studying a character, pay attention to their motives. Okay, this is how you know it's time for you to transition from archaeology to artistry. You have a sense of abundance. There's more than you need. There's a natural urge to preach and write, and I suggest that you talk out loud as soon as you feel like you need to, because speaking out loud actually helps a sermon come into being. Use the car drives. If you started early enough, then your commute becomes a help for preaching. The time going to the hospital becomes a help for preaching. The dropped out meeting, the person who didn't show up, becomes gift time for you to work on your sermon. That moment some idea comes to you in the shower, start talking about it in the shower. Write it down afterwards. If you brainstorm by writing, then write, then speak, either way. You also begin to have a certain level of personal life change, which most preachers don't start early enough in their preparation process to allow to happen, so they don't experience the great benefit of the preaching life, which is that you become a better Christian while being a better preacher. You need to have that level of participation in the wisdom you're trying to present for you to know how to help people. If you haven't gone the road, you don't know how to tell them to travel the road, but you might think you do. We end up giving them WikiHow steps that don't really help them know the in-betweens, the flesh in between the bones of those steps. The next indication it might be time to transition to focusing on artistry is the bones begin to assemble. Remember Ezekiel 37? All you've got is a bunch of dry bones in the valley. And you feel like the Lord is telling you, well, prophesy. Can these bones live? You alone know, O Lord. You alone know. I feel that way every time in a sermon. And he says, prophesy to them. In other words, start speaking over them. Don't wait. They're dead. The sermon's dead. It has no life. Start speaking. So as an act of faith, in a sense, as an act of faith and an invitation for the Spirit to help guide our preaching, we begin to speak and begin to write, and then the bones begin to assemble. The longer you wait to move to artistry, once you have abundance, the longer you're delaying the Spirit being able to use that motion in you to direct you. And maybe the most important indication that you're ready to shift to artistry is that you get stuck. Most preachers are very frustrated by this part of preaching. It took me a long time to realize I was not alone, and that every single preacher I worked with, talked with, related to, coached, gets stuck. You will get stuck. It's actually part of the process. I like to illustrate this with little Mark Ruffalo moment from the movies of Marvel. This was Infinity War, when a new villain shows up. Iron Man and the wizard, Dr. Strange, are trying to protect the Infinity Stone they have against this new villain, and they are getting beaten. They want the Hulk to show up. They're asking Ruffalo if their big green giant's going to show up anytime soon. The Hulk has been traumatized and doesn't want to come out to play. He's striving and he's straining. There's an immediate moment with an immediate need, and he just can't get the Hulk come out. So as he's straining here, There's a Hulk hidden inside of him that he's experienced before, and he's trying to make it come out. And it's sort of like he's going back and forth like this. I didn't want to risk the technology and show you the video, but back and forth, back and forth. That's the experience of the preacher on Saturday night trying to hulk up a sermon, sometimes Sunday morning. It's exhausting. And many preachers, they follow the old phrase, when in doubt, shout. So they don't have clarity on their sermon. They don't have the illustrations they wish they had. So they just make up for it with passionate yelling. And it wears not only the preacher out, it wears the people out. I just want you to realize that stuck is a key step, but you want to get there sooner rather than later so that you have time to get unstuck. It's a step of dependence on the Lord. So you want to be stuck with abundance as soon as possible. Now, many preachers say they're stuck, and when I dig into the surface with them, have you done this? Have you done this? Have you done this? Have you done your detailed observations? Have you done any word studies? Have you checked the historical context, the literary context? Have you begun to write a focus statement, function statement, future statement? Those are things I describe briefly in my book, but they're ways of bridging from archaeology to artistry. If you haven't, you're not stuck with abundance, you're just stuck. You haven't done your work. Archaeology is characterized by disciplined digging. You have to carry the sermon before the sermon will carry you. We'll have time for questions here at the end. Just want to mention that. But some practical implications. You need forced blocks of time. You need to schedule them. I have them on my calendar every week. It says sermon preparation time. Do not cancel. Only move. My administrative assistant knows that if she has to put a meeting there, she has to move that time to somewhere else, and she knows when my best biorhythm times are. I'm most creative early in the morning. Don't try to make me be creative at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. It just won't happen. 3 p.m. in the afternoon, put a meeting there where all I have to do is sit and listen and nod and say, okay, sure, I'm happy with that. Don't make me do creative work. Advanced planning, 6 months out. This next week, I'm leading a group of 3 churches, my own included. We're all gathering together, lead pastors and a few select staff, to work on our next year's cycle of preaching. We're planning out the entire year. In 3 days, we're locking ourselves away in a room. We're doing nothing else for 3 days. I've already done surveys. I've gotten feedback from the pastoral staff. I've looked over the flow of last year's preaching and balance of texts and balance of functions of preaching. And now we're going to plan for the next year. And then we'll revisit it 6 months from now for a 1-day retreat to tighten anything that needs to be repaired and push it out a little bit farther. Having that preparation work allows you to start 13 days before the sermon with focused exegesis, because you know what you're actually supposed to study. I also have a document for you that if you email Lisa, she's going to allow you to have this document from me. It's a basic plan for preaching, and I have 2 documents. One is if you take Mondays off, one is if you take Fridays off. It's also a part of the book. It's explained in detail in chapter 6. A rhythm for your preaching life that helps you work on 2 sermons at a time so that you always have momentum by the time you get to the week of preaching. And you never wake up Monday morning thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to say Sunday? You wake up Monday morning thinking, all right, now how am I going to say that Sunday? I know what I'm going to say. Now, how am I going to say it? And you have all that time in that week for both your own life to change and for your illustrations to come. If you want to speed up your archaeology, the best way to do it is to sharpen your study skills. Sharpen your use of interlinears, theological dictionaries. If you have biblical language capacity, whatever capacity you can develop there, but to sharpen your ability to do detailed observations, especially, is an important piece. Learn how to see what's there. I'll recommend one book that's a helpful, very easy, accessible book, David Thompson's Bible Study That Works. If you don't have formal biblical training, David Thompson's Bible Study That Works is a very easy to read introduction to it. There's other books I could recommend if you wanted to go deeper into biblical study skills. Big important thing internally, stop trying to be interesting at the beginning of your sermon prep. Instead, focus on being interested. Get interested in that text and dig. Ask your questions. Be interested in the answers. Don't be satisfied with easy answers or assuming that you already know what the text means, and it will lead you to something good. Well, I need to keep moving. The second mode is artistry, and archaeology never goes away. It just becomes minor, almost like a two-step dance. You just bounce off of the artistry leg and lean on the archaeology leg at the beginning stages, and then you switch. And once you're in artistry, you bounce off the archaeology leg and lean on the artistry leg. So you're checking your biblical study to make sure your artistic ideas are working. The artistry stage, it's characterized by focused playfulness. We do have to play with the text. I wonder what it means. What would happen if? Well, what is this text trying to say? What would have happened if David didn't do X? What if David had gone to war instead of stayed on the roof of his house? How might this story have played out differently? Those kinds of playful questionings help you. It's also a focused playfulness to just take an object and shove it up against the text and try to see how it might illustrate it. This is just a random one. It's on my desk, so I grabbed it. I'll give you a brief illustration from David's life. Have you ever taken, okay, here's a good one. This is fun. This is on the fly. And you can do this too with practice. You learn how to do this. Have you ever picked up a marker to write on a dry erase board and then realized that you didn't have a dry erase marker? You had a permanent Sharpie. A friend of mine actually did that on a projection screen, not on a dry erase board, which is actually a little more fixable. He did it on a projection screen on accident. He thought it was a white erase board, which was behind the projection screen. So not only did he not have a white erase board, he didn't have a erasable marker. And he marked on the projection screen before he realized that it was on a screen, and he had a permanent marker. That mark is still on that screen. David seems to think that when he was on that roof, he could write with a white erase marker on a erasable board with his sin with Bathsheba. But the more he tried to fix that situation, the more the smudge spread, until he finally realized that sin seems to always be something of a permanent marker in our lives, that even though grace comes and we are forgiven, the consequences endure. And grace does not wipe away the consequences of the evil we do to others. There. Now, there's a quick illustration. But it's focused playfulness. We have a content in mind, and then we play with it, and artistry comes to bear. The core commitment is that preaching brings word to life and life to words. The end result is a life-changing sermon. My timer says 35 minutes on my talk here, but I think maybe we're closing in. Is that right, Pelham? How much time do we need to save here? Should I be done now, or can I go to a couple more things real briefly?
Throw in a couple of more things. Can I give you 3 minutes, Dave? We
Great.
want to have some Q&A.
Great. I might even take less than that. And we can share these slides. Lisa can do that as well for what we're missing. This is the most important thing, and then we'll be done. With your artistry, you're always painting with this 3-part canvas. As you ask questions of the text, primarily ask, what does it teach me about God? His character, will, and way begins to emerge. Let the text focus on God. The Bible is about God, not about us. The second thing that emerges is the broken human condition. Let the scriptures diagnose the human condition. How does this reveal to me who we are? How does this reveal myself to me? How does this become a mirror to me in my own life? That will help me have empathy with how it reveals others. How does it give me transferable components of the human condition? What are the human needs that are unmet, that are being chased in sinful ways? How are they being met in righteous ways? And then the middle component usually comes last. What is the good news? How does this passage reveal a specific good news so that God's character is gospeling the human condition? When I can state that in a sentence, how in this passage, God's character is gospeling the human condition, all of the creativity I'm going to use, imagery, illustrations, stories, quotations, carefully crafted phrases, are then driven by this focused gateway that comes out of my archaeology. So instead of being stuck with abundance, I'm choosing out of that abundance what one thing I'm going to say. And it's about God, first and foremost. And how God gospels the human condition. If I'm stuck and I can't move forward with artistry, that's usually the primary problem. Once that's clear, I can shove any illustration up against it. Almost always, it becomes more helpful than it was before. Archaeology, artistry, but start early. The earlier you start, the more time you have for your subconscious to work, for the spirit to bring things to you, for your own life to change, and illustrations to show up every corner you turn.